When Eleanor Hayes, 68, stepped into her ex-husband Robert's funeral, the room fell silent. Cold stares, hushed whispers, and a heavy atmosphere hinted at an impending storm. 12 years after their divorce, she was an outsider to Robert's second wife, Linda, and their daughters, Claire and Sophie. But when the lawyer announced her name in the will, assumptions crumbled. What secrets had Robert kept? Would the truth heal old wounds or reopen them? Eleanor walked slowly into the church, her low heels clicking softly on the polished wood floor. Light from stained glass windows bathed her in a gentle glow, but it couldn't warm the chill of the eyes fixed on her. She sensed the shift immediately. Conversations halted, glances darted, and sharp intakes of breath filled the air. "Is that Eleanor?" A whisper came from the right. "What's she doing here?" Another voice hissed, sharp as a blade. Eleanor didn't turn. She kept her back straight, chin slightly raised, and chose a pew near the back where she could observe without drawing too much attention. She set her pale gray coat beside her, smoothing it with deliberate care, as if preparing for a trial where she was the defendant. The church was adorned, simply yet elegantly, with white lilies filling the air with sweet fragrance and soft organ music drifting through the space. At the front, Robert Carson, once the center of Eleanor's world, lay in an open oak casket. His face, carefully made up, bore the marks of time, deeper wrinkles, whiter hair than when she'd last seen him. Beside the casket, Linda sat in the front row, shoulders trembling as if crying, but Eleanor noticed the tissue in Linda's hand was barely creased. It was a performance, something Linda excelled at, feigning grief without feeling it. Claire and Sophie sat close to Linda, their nearness twisting Eleanor's heart. Claire, blonde hair tied high, stared at her hands, avoiding her mother's gaze. Sophie, younger and more sensitive, glanced at Eleanor briefly before looking away as if caught. Eleanor didn't blame her daughters. She understood their distance. 12 years was long enough for stories to twist, for Linda and Robert to craft a narrative where Eleanor was the cold, overly emotional mother who couldn't hold the family together. But she hadn't come to fix misunderstandings or reclaim their love. She came for a deeper reason, one she struggled to define: to face the past, to mark the end of a chapter that had once been her everything. Robert, despite betraying her, despite making her feel invisible, was someone she'd loved fiercely. And a part of her, the most resilient part, needed to witness this closure, to stand here not as a victim, but as a survivor. As she sat, whispers rose again, like waves against the shore. "She looks so old," one voice said, loud enough for her to hear. "After everything, how dare she show up?" another added. Eleanor didn't react. She'd learned to let such words pass like wind through bare branches. She focused on her breath, the cool wood of the pew beneath her fingers. She wasn't here to cause a scene or prove anything to these people. They didn't know the full story, and most never cared to learn it. To them, Eleanor was a name tied to gossip. The abandoned wife, the distant mother, the woman who vanished after divorce. But she knew the truth, a small flame still burning within her, however faintly, through all those years. The pastor began his sermon, his warm voice recounting Robert's life. A successful man, a devoted father, a respected community member in Savannah. Eleanor listened, but her mind drifted to old memories she'd buried. She recalled their first Christmas, decorating a tiny tree with handmade ornaments, laughing in their cramped apartment. She remembered their first Savannah home, where she painted walls beige and planted clematis in the garden. She thought of afternoons teaching Claire to ride a bike, Sophie's giggles as she scribbled finger-painted art. Those moments had been everything, the foundation of a life she believed would last forever. But somewhere along the way, they were replaced by silence. Dinners where Robert only nodded when she asked about his day. Nights she sat alone while he was busy, late. When the pastor finished, a few relatives shared memories of Robert. Linda stood, voice choking, speaking of his final years, how he always put family first. Eleanor nearly smiled at the irony. Family, but not hers. She looked at Claire and Sophie, hoping for a glance, a sign they remembered the years she'd poured her heart into building their world. But there was nothing. Claire's face stayed neutral. Sophie bit her lip, holding something back. Eleanor reminded herself she didn't need their validation, not today. She'd survived years of being forgotten, and she'd survived this morning. Then the moment came. Henry Walsh, a tall lawyer with silver hair and a gray suit, stepped to the podium. He set down his briefcase, adjusted his glasses, and spoke clearly. "I'm tasked with reading a portion of Mr. Robert Carson's final will." The room seemed to hold its breath. Linda sat straighter, her hands stilling. Claire looked up from her phone. Sophie watched Henry, eyes curious. Eleanor's heart beat faster, though she wasn't sure why. She'd braced herself to hear about Linda, the girls, anyone but her. But Henry opened his folder, cleared his throat, and read, "To Mrs. Eleanor Hayes." Every eye snapped to her, sharp as spotlights. Linda froze. Claire blinked, stunned. Sophie's mouth opened, but she said nothing. The whispers stopped, replaced by a stifling silence. Eleanor didn't move, but inside she felt a jolt, a sign that the story she thought was over was opening a new, unexpected chapter. Eleanor's small Atlanta apartment was a quiet retreat, not chosen for solitude, but born of exhaustion after years of trying to hold a fracturing family together. Robert's casual request for space, light as a passing remark, had pushed her out of the Savannah home, leaving behind photo albums, her camera, and her mother's quilt. His betrayal, the late nights, his sharp cologne, Linda's floral perfume on his coats, had carved itself into her mind. Claire's cold acceptance and Sophie's innocent tears only sharpened the pain. But in that empty silence, Eleanor sensed a spark of hope, a chance to rediscover the woman she'd buried under years of sacrifice. A letter, hidden in her late brother's belongings, would become the flame guiding her toward healing and reclaiming her worth. The first months in Atlanta were a fog of survival. Her apartment, with faded carpet and creaking pipes, felt more like a prison than a home. She took a job as a library assistant, shelving books and greeting patrons with a forced smile that never reached her eyes. The pay was modest, but it kept her afloat. At night, she sat on a second-hand couch, the TV droning reruns to drown out the quiet. She avoided the bedroom, its empty bed a reminder of Robert's absence, not just now, but in the years he was physically there but emotionally gone. Meals were simple, sometimes skipped. She opened old photo albums, tracing pictures. Clara's first recital, Sophie's gap-toothed grin, a honeymoon snapshot of her Robert laughing on a beach. Had they been happy? Or had she just wanted to believe they were? The questions gnawed, each a reminder of the life she'd built for others, only to be left behind. Her daughter's calls were rare. Claire's were brief, dutiful. "Just checking in, Mom," her voice cold, echoing Robert's narrative that Eleanor was too emotional, too weak to hold the family. Sophie's were warmer but hesitant, as if sensing the truth but not ready to face it. Eleanor lied to both, saying she was settling in and finding herself. In truth, she was adrift, her identity reduced to the role she'd lost: wife, mother, keeper of a home, now Linda's. The lowest moment came during a lunch break at the library, scrolling a local news site and seeing a photo. Robert, Linda, Claire, and Sophie at a charity gala, smiling as if they'd always been a unit. The image was a knife, her family, whole without her. She fled to the bathroom, collapsing in a stall, sobbing into her sleeves. She didn't just mourn Robert. She mourned the realization no one seemed to miss her. She'd poured herself into others, and when she stopped, she'd vanished. Rock bottom was quiet, not a crash, but a slow sinking. Yet in that stillness, Eleanor found something unexpected. A faint pulse of resilience. It began on an ordinary Tuesday, when she decided to clear out a storage closet. Among boxes labeled kitchen and photos was one marked Tom. her brother who died of cancer the previous year. Tom had been her anchor during the divorce, bringing groceries and blunt honesty. "You're more than his wife, Elle." She pulled the box to her dining table, hands trembling as she sifted through his flannel shirts and woodworking sketches. At the bottom was a yellow envelope, her name in Tom's handwriting. "Eleanor, read when you're ready." Her breath caught. She opened it, revealing a short note and a folded letter. Tom's note read, "Sis, I found this after your divorce. You were too broken then, but you deserve the truth. Love, Tom." The second letter was from Robert. Its ink faded but legible. "Eleanor," it began, "if you're reading this, I never found the courage to say it aloud. I left not because I stopped loving you, but because you reminded me of the man I failed to be. You gave me a home, 2 daughters, a life I didn't deserve, and I repaid you with silence. Linda doesn't know the real me. You did. You were never the problem. You were the best part." Eleanor sat frozen, the letter trembling in her hands. Tears welled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she felt a crack within, not of pain, but of release. For years, she'd believed she was disposable, her love a burden. Now, Robert's words, raw and belated, confirmed what she dared not trust. Her worth had always been there, unseen but undeniable. She framed the letter, placing it on a bookshelf, not for Robert, but as a marker of her truth. That letter was a turning point. The fog shrouding her life began to lift, not in a rush, but in quiet moments. Eleanor started waking early, opening windows to let in Atlanta's crisp air. She bought a journal, its pages filling with clumsy, then fluid reflections: childhood, marriage, small joys she'd forgotten, like the smell of developer in her darkroom. She stopped dyeing her hair, letting the silver shine, a rebellion against the youth she'd chased for a man now gone. The mirror reflected a woman she was beginning to recognize, not as a wife or mother, but as Eleanor, unhidden and real. She returned to the community center where she'd once taught photography, the scent of chemicals and paper pulling her back to herself. She signed up to lead a weekly class for women over 60, most coming not to master photography, but to feel seen. They shared stories of loss, reinvention, and quiet triumphs, their laughter and tears weaving a community that reminded Eleanor what belonging meant. Through their lens, she saw her own strength. She began setting boundaries, saying no to Claire's half-hearted invites where Linda loomed, no to Sophie's gentle pleas to move on. These weren't walls, but gates she controlled, reclaiming her space and voice. A chance meeting with Paul, a lawyer friend of Tom's, brought another shift. Over coffee, Paul reviewed Eleanor's divorce papers and uncovered a trust Robert had set up in her name 6 months before his death. A Savannah house, fully paid, and a $500,000 zero-cents fund for women artists, untouchable by Linda. He was trying to make amends, Paul said, in his own flawed way. The discovery wasn't about money, it was about power, the kind that let Eleanor choose her future. She moved back to the Savannah house, painting its walls soft blue, tending the clematis she'd planted decades ago. Each act was a reclamation, not of the past, but of herself. Standing in her garden, camera in hand, Eleanor felt the stirrings of a life no longer defined by loss, but by possibility. A life she was finally ready to claim. The law office of Walsh & Associates was plain, its beige carpet and leather chairs exuding a sterile calm that masked the simmering tension. Eleanor arrived early, silver hair in a neat bun, navy dress, simple but elegant. She carried a composure honed through years of silent endurance, setting her purse gently on the floor as she sat across the long oval table. Linda sat at the head, black blazer crisp, lips a tight line, fingers tapping restlessly. Claire beside her scrolled her phone, face indifferent, while Sophie, off to the side, clasped her hands tightly, eyes flickering toward Eleanor before darting away. The room was a microcosm of the life Eleanor once knew. Linda the usurper, Claire her father's echo, Sophie the daughter who might still see her. No one greeted her, no one stood. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She was no longer the woman who shrank under scrutiny. She was here to close a chapter, not to beg for a place in their story. Henry Walsh entered, tall with silver hair and calm authority, carrying a thick folder. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice cutting the silence. "Thank you for attending. This is the final reading of Robert Carson's last will and testament." He set his materials down, adjusted his glasses, and began with legal formalities. Statements of sound mind, revocation of prior wills. The room shifted, impatience rippling through Linda's rigid posture and Claire's restless fingers. Sophie's gaze stayed on Henry, as if sensing something monumental. Eleanor sat still, breath steady, her knowledge of the trust her anchor. She'd reviewed the documents with Paul weeks earlier, knew the Savannah house and the Artists Fund were hers, knew Robert had ensured Linda couldn't contest them. But she hadn't come to gloat or fight. She'd come for the truth to be spoken aloud, before those who'd rewritten her as a footnote. Henry's voice grew weighty. Per the decedent's final amendment dated July 12th, the following assets are to be distributed as outlined. Linda leaned forward, nails stilling. Claire pocketed her phone. Sophie's hands tightened. "To Mrs. Eleanor Hayes," Henry read, "the Savannah property at 1423 Magnolia Lane, fully deeded with no liens, mortgage paid in full by the decedent prior to his passing." A collective gasp broke the silence. Linda's face froze, knuckles whitening as she gripped the table. Claire blinked rapidly, composure cracking. Sophie's mouth parted, eyes locking on Eleanor with shock and something softer. Recognition, perhaps. Eleanor met their gazes, expression serene, her silence louder than their reactions. Henry continued, unfazed. "Additionally to Mrs. Hayes, the Robert Carson Creative Arts Fund, established to support women over 50 in artistic pursuits, valued at $500,000, 0 cents, to be managed in her name. This fund is non-transferable and not subject to contest." The room seemed to shrink, the air sucked out by the weight of Henry's words. Linda's voice, sharp and brittle, cut through. "There's been a mistake." Her tone mixed disbelief and defiance, as if sheer will could rewrite the will. Henry didn't blink. "All documents are valid and notarized. The trust was reviewed by our office and the probate court." His matter-of-fact delivery silenced her, but her eyes burned with barely contained fury. Claire stared at the table, fingers twisting a bracelet, while Sophie's gaze lingered on Eleanor, searching for answers. The whispers from the funeral, painting Eleanor as an intruder, were now irrelevant. The truth, laid bare in legal ink, had shifted the narrative. Henry pulled a single sheet from his folder. "The decedent also left a personal statement addressed to those present. With your permission, I'd like to read it." No one objected, though Linda's jaw tightened. He unfolded the paper and read. His voice steady but resonant. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone. If Eleanor is here, she's stronger than I ever gave her credit for, though I always knew it. To those surprised by my choices, know this. I made mistakes I can't undo. I left the woman who built me, who believed in me when I was nothing. Linda, you were there in my final years, and I'm grateful, but you stepped into a story Eleanor wrote. Claire, Sophie, your mother gave up more than you'll ever grasp. If you're angry, sit with it. Then look at the woman across from you. She deserves what I couldn't give her when it mattered." Henry folded the letter, placing it back in the file. The room was a vacuum, no one daring to move. Linda's face was a mask of controlled rage, Claire's a mix of defensiveness and confusion, Sophie's softened by guilt. Eleanor felt the weight of their eyes, but didn't waver. She'd carried their judgments for years, let them define her as the one who'd failed. Now, Robert's words, raw, imperfect, final, had stripped that narrative away. She spoke, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the silence. "I didn't come for a fight. I came to close a chapter I never got to finish." The simplicity of her words, the absence of malice, seemed to unsettle the room. more than any outburst could. Linda stood abruptly, gathering her purse and coat, her heels clicking sharply as she exited, a retreating figure in a battle she'd already lost. Claire watched her go, her expression unreadable, while Sophie gave Eleanor a small nod, a gesture so subtle yet so profound, it felt like a bridge forming. Eleanor rose, thanking Henry quietly, and walked out, her steps measured, her heart steady. The truth had been spoken not by her, but by the man who'd once silenced her. She didn't need their approval or their tears. She'd come to face the past, and in doing so, she'd claimed the present. As she stepped into the Savannah sunlight, the weight of 12 years lifted, replaced by a certainty that whatever came next, she was no longer invisible. Not to herself, and now, not to them. Eleanor stepped out of the law office into Savannah's warm sunlight, the burden of the will reading lifting from her shoulders. Henry Walsh's voice still echoed her name in the will, the Savannah house, the $500,000 0 cents arts fund, Robert's letter confessing his regrets, Linda's abrupt exit, Claire's stunned silence, and Sophie's subtle nod marked the end of a chapter Eleanor had carried alone. She faced the room not to reclaim what was lost, but to honor the woman who'd survived. Now, standing in her reclaimed garden, she was ready to live fully as herself. Back in the Savannah house, Eleanor made it her own. She painted the walls sage green, hung her photographs, and tended the clematis, coaxing life from neglected roots. A call from Paul revealed more. Robert had hidden assets. Stocks, a firm worth $1,500,000, 0 cents, legally hers due to an incomplete divorce settlement. She redirected a portion to a scholarship in Tom's name, keeping the rest to live simply but freely. Linda banished from Savannah. Claire sent a tentative text, "I didn't know," but remained distant. Eleanor replied without anger, her peace no longer tied to their approval. Sophie arrived one afternoon unannounced, her car crunching the gravel driveway. They sat on the porch, the wicker bench creaking under their weight. I didn't know, Mom," Sophie said, her voice cracking. "I know," Eleanor replied, her hand covering Sophie's. They talked not of pain, but of life. Sophie's job, her doubts, her dreams. No grand apologies, just presence. Real and enough. Sophie visited often, sometimes joining Eleanor's photography classes, their bond a quiet healing. Eleanor's days filled with purpose. She taught photography 3 times a week, her students' stories mirroring her own, women rediscovering themselves through art. She hosted workshops in the house, turning pain into creation. Her journal, nearly full, sat beside Tom's photo and Robert's letter, a testament to her journey. Scars remained. The sting of Robert's dismissal, the ache of Claire's distance, but they no longer defined her. They were old photographs, real but powerless. One Sunday, Eleanor sat in her reading nook, sunlight filtering through lace curtains, a jazz record spinning softly. She held a steaming tea, her camera nearby, and felt a stillness, not of loss, but of peace. She was Eleanor Hayes, 68, silver-haired, unbroken, painting her life with bold strokes. Claire might come around or not. That was her path. Sophie's visits were enough. The house, the garden, the art, they were hers, built from resilience. Healing wasn't erasing the past, it was remembering who she was. As she picked up her camera, Eleanor smiled, ready for whatever frame came next.